Hello, welcome to module 3.2. In this module, we're going to talk about how to measure poverty. And so we're going to go over basically three measures of poverty. The first is the headcount ratio, which is basically the fraction of the population that is in poverty. The second is going to be the total poverty gap, as well as the average poverty gap, which is a measure of basically how much money it would cost us to get everybody out of poverty in a country. And then the third is going to be something called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is more of an outcome-based measure of poverty, which actually looks at the deprivations of poverty rather than the potential to be in poverty caused by income. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at the notes that are on Canvas. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to come up with a definition for poverty. And so you can think of a number of different things in terms of what does it actually mean to be in a state of poverty. And the first thing that we're going to do is basically say, all right, how much income do you have to satisfy basic survival needs? If you have less income than that, then that's what we're going to say is sort of your income potential based measure of poverty. So the World Bank currently uses a threshold of $1.90 a day adjusted for differences in living costs between countries to measure what they call absolute poverty. Now, just to give you a little bit of sort of historical context on this, initially when the World Bank came up with their definition of absolute poverty, what they did basically is they went to India and they said, all right, there's a lot of poor people in India. What's the poverty line in India? And then they converted that into PPP adjusted dollars, and it turned out to be about $1 a day. And so basically that was the initial definition of absolute poverty. If you earned less than PPP adjusted $1 a day, you were considered to be in a state of absolute poverty. In 2005, the World Bank decided, hey, let's do an update. And rather than just looking at the poverty line in India, what they did is they said, let's take the 15 poorest countries in the world and let's average the poverty lines in the 15 poorest countries in the world. The poverty lines basically defined by each country's national poverty line. So each country basically has their own sort of national definition of poverty, again, based off of what's the income that you need to meet basic survival needs. And so they took those 15 national poverty lines, the 15 poorest countries in the world, averaged them out, and it turned out that once you did the PPP adjustments, this was $1.25 a day. So it doesn't seem like that's a huge difference, $1 a day, $1.25 a day, 25 cents, whatever. It ended up making a huge difference. The number of people that were classified in a state of absolute poverty increased from 931 million, 1.76 billion. So almost three quarters of a million, actually more than three quarters of a billion people went from not being classified as absolutely poor to being classified as in absolute poverty. Now, for those people, it didn't really matter to them. If you're making $1.10 a day, you weren't poor before, you were poor afterwards. In reality, you were poor one way or the other, probably. So really, the only reason this matters is in terms of bringing greater attention to the problem of poverty around the world. And it doesn't make a difference, in an individual's life, whether they're being classified as poor or not, only unless, being classified as absolutely poor does qualify them for some kind of program. To kind of give you an idea or sort of a picture of what this, sort of reclassification did, what I've got here is a diagram that shows the log of mean household expenditure on the horizontal axis. And it's just a measure of sort of spending by households. A little bit better than income because it actually shows what people are spending on. And then the poverty line, PPP adjusted, and this is in dollars per month, so divide it by 30 if you want to get dollars per day, across all of these countries. And so basically what you see here, and you see these countries, the size of the circles representative of the population, is to the left of this vertical line marked with A represents the 15 countries that the World Bank reclassified their poverty definition as up to $125 a day. And then you see other countries like India, China, for example. And what you see here is that, they might have actually been better off using the original definition because there's a lot more people in India than there were in these 15 poorest countries combined. And it turned out that sort of the average poverty line of these 15 poorest countries is actually a little bit higher than the national poverty line in India, despite the fact that India is a bit richer than those countries. Just there's a lower in India. And so basically we're defining poverty off of a country like Guinea-Bissau, which has no people basically in comparison to India. And so, again, this is really just how are we going to define poverty, right? And the larger we increase the poverty threshold, obviously, the more people we're going to classify as poor. In 2015, the World Bank redid their definition of absolute poverty and increased it up to $1.90 a day. Basically, it's becoming more expensive to live, and so you need more money to not be classified as poor. And as you'd expect, this led to an increase in the number of people classified as in absolute poverty went up by another 150 million people or so. So, a couple takeaways from this. First is that we really need to be careful about what we're using as our poverty threshold, because it really does make a difference in terms of how many people we're counting as poor. And second, there's a lot of people that are either just below or just above whatever poverty threshold we're choosing. So, when we increase that poverty threshold just by, and we're not even talking $1 a day, we're talking like 25 or 50 cents, whatever it is we're increasing it by, this can have an enormous impact. So there's a lot of people that are right around, maybe they're not classified as absolutely poor, but they're just barely above that threshold. Okay, so once we have a definition of absolute poverty, and again, if we use the same definition for everybody, then we can at least make cross-country comparisons, right? But let's say $1.90 is an appropriate definition of absolute poverty. Then we can do two to measure poverty in a country. The first is something called the headcount ratio. So the headcount ratio is quite simple. It's basically you count the number of people in a country that are below some poverty line. So we could use $1.90 a day. If we want to use the absolute poverty line, use the national definition of the poverty line, which is going to be different in every country. So in the US, for example, it's something like $10,000 a year. And basically, we just count the number of people that are classified as in a state of poverty and divide that by the population. So it's a share of the population that's poor. And so let's take a look, for example, at headcount ratios across countries using two different definitions. So the first is the World Bank's definition of absolute poverty. It's under $1.90 a day. And then the second is their definition of what they call lower middle income poverty. This is what the poverty line is on average in not the lowest income countries, but lower middle income countries. And what you see here is that there's a lot of variation in poverty, certainly. If you have a country like Tanzania, where almost half of the population is in a state of absolute poverty, then quarters of the population is in lower middle income poverty. Then you compare that to a country like Costa Rica, where only about 1.4% of the population is in absolute poverty, and then 3.6% is in lower middle income poverty. So you can see a lot of variation between developing countries. The second thing to note is that when we go and we change the definition of poverty from $1.90 to $3.20 a day, the numbers jump more for some countries than they do for others. So if we take, for example, we take a look at a country like Serbia, where 5.5% of the population earns under $1.90 a day. If we increase that number to $3.20 a day, the number goes up to 9.8%, which is an increase, but it's not anywhere close to the kind of increase that we see in a country like Indonesia, where Indonesia actually has a lower rate of absolute poverty than Serbia, but a much higher rate of lower middle income poverty. So what we take from this basically is that the poor people in Serbia are really poor. They're really far below that absolute poverty line, but there's not as big of a share of the population that's just above that absolute poverty line as there is in a country like Indonesia. So again, this is kind of getting at what I mentioned at the end of the last section, which is that we really need to consider not just poverty by itself or inequality by itself, but both poverty and inequality together. The distribution of income is going to matter when we also are considering poverty. So anyway, the headcount ratio, real simple, just count the number of people that are below poverty. A problem with the headcount ratio, though, is it doesn't really tell us how bad poverty is, right? It tells us how many people are in poverty, but it doesn't really mention, how far below the poverty line is, people actually are, or how much would it cost us to reduce poverty in a country. And to get at that, we use something called the total poverty gap. So the total poverty gap, and we're going to go through a couple of examples on the whiteboard in a minute, basically starts off with a question of how much money would we need to spend to move everybody who's below some poverty up to that poverty threshold. So let's say, hypothetically, that the poverty line is $300 a month, so $1 a day times 30, that's actually not right, $10 a day. Would give it to you, right? Let's just say, just for ease of exposition, there's $300 a month. So basically is you take each poor person in the country and you look how far below the poverty line, I should say $300 a year, dollar a day over 300 days, that works. Okay, sorry. You say, all right, each individual poor person, how much money would I need to give them to bring them up to the poverty line? So the equation for it looks kind of scary, but it's basically just notation. Essentially, what you're doing here is you're taking the sum, okay, of all the poor people in the country. So that's why we're summing up to H, which is the head count, the total number of poor people in the country. And we're basically just adding for each of these poor people the difference between their income, YI, and the income that they would need to get up to the poverty line, YP. So whatever we define that as. We're going to use 300 just to make it easy, but you could define it based off of whatever it is. If you're using $1.90 a day, then it's $1.90 a day times 365 is whatever that yearly income is going to be, right? Or if you're going to use a national, and let's say it's $10,000 in the US, then you would say, how much money would I need to give each individual poor person in the US to get them up to $10,000? And so basically we just add that over all of the poor people in the country. Sometimes it's useful to just get a single, number. And so we'll sometimes also use what's known as the average poverty gap. And so the average poverty gap is the total poverty gap. Again, how much money would we need to spend to eliminate poverty? And then we divide that by the total number of poor people to get how much money on average would we need to spend per poor person to get rid of poverty. So we'll go the example in the notes, and then we'll go through a couple of different numerical examples to actually see how the calculation works. So what I've got here is country A. Country A has 5 people, and I've got their annual incomes listed here. And we're going to assume that the poverty line is $300 a year. Okay? So in country A, person 1 makes $100, person 2 makes $200, person 3 makes $350, 4 makes $400, 5 makes $450. Okay. So the first thing is let's figure out how many people are classified as poor in country A. All the people that have incomes below the poverty line. So person 1 is below the poverty line, person 2 is below the poverty line, everybody else is above the poverty line. So to compute the total poverty gap, we need to figure out how much money would we need to spend to get everybody up to the poverty line. So person 1 makes $100. They need $200 to get up to the poverty line. Person 2 makes $200. They would need an additional $100 to get out of poverty. So when we compute the total poverty gap for country A, again, what we're going to do is we're going to take the gap between the poverty line and person 1's income, 300 minus 100, and then the gap between person 2's income and the poverty line, 300 minus 200, add those two together, and we end up with a total amount that we would need to spend to eliminate poverty in country A of $300. That's the total poverty gap. To figure out the average poverty gap, you figure by the total number of poor people in country A. There's 2 poor people in country A. We need to spend on average $150 per poor person to get rid of poverty in country A. Let's take a look at the second country, country B. Country B has 6 people. And if we look at these numbers, we can see that persons 1, 2, and 3 all have incomes below the poverty line of $300. So the head count in country B is 3. The head count ratio in country B is 3 over 6 of 50%. So it's interesting. If we look and compare countries A and country B, the head count ratio in country B is 50%. The head count ratio over here in country A, remember there's only 2 poor people in country A out of 5 total. So the head count ratio in country A is only 40%. So if we just looked at the head count ratio, we'd say, oh, poverty is worse in country B, 50% versus 40%. But we need to actually compute the total poverty gap to really make a qualified assessment about how bad poverty is. So for country B, we're going to again figure out how much money would we need to spend to eliminate poverty. So how much money would we need to give to persons 1, 2, and 3 to get them up to that poverty line of 300? So we do that over here. Basically, it's the gap between person 1's income and the poverty line, the gap between person 2's income and the poverty line, the gap between person 3's poverty line. You do that, you need to give $100 to person 1, $60 to person 2, $40 to person 3, and you end up with a total poverty gap of $200. Now, because the populations are different, this is why sometimes it's useful for us to compute the average poverty gap, because it allows us to compare a country with a huge population to a country with a small population, because obviously the country with a huge population is going to cost more to eliminate poverty. So the average poverty gap allows us to make these cross-country comparisons. So the $200 total that you would spend across the 3 poor people in country B, and you end up with an average amount of $67. So you would only need to spend $67 per poor person in country B as compared to $150 per poor person in country A. So that suggests that even though a greater share of country B's population is in a state of poverty, the severity of poverty is actually worse in country A. Now, does that mean that poverty is actually worse in country A? Difficult to say. There's fewer people in A that are poor, but those that are poor are worse off than those that are poor in country B. So let's, before we move on, actually take a look at a few other examples. And I've got this. I'm going to have to stop this share, and then we'll switch over to the whiteboard. Okay, so I've got here two basically, these are essentially size but basically 2 countries, and for ease of exposition, I've got the same number of people in both countries, and we've got here countries A and B. And if you actually did the math, you'll see that actually total income in both of these countries is exactly the same. So let's go ahead and do some calculations. So first off, let's compute the headcount ratio in country A. So we know that the headcount in country A is going to be 3. 1, 2, 3 people have incomes below the poverty line of 300. So we're always going to assume 300 is the poverty line. Just in these calculations, just makes life easy. All right, so I know the headcount is 3. Therefore, the headcount ratio, which is the headcount in country A divided by the population in country A, is going to be equal to 3/6, which is 50%. So half the population in country A is in a state of poverty. Now let's do the same thing over here in country B. So the headcount in country B is going to be the number of poor people in country B. So the number of people with incomes below the poverty line, which we're assuming to be 300. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 people that are below that poverty line. Headcount ratio, again, the headcount over the population, is going to be 4/6, which is 67%. Okay, so a higher percentage of people are poor in country B than in country A. Now let's compute the total poverty gaps in both places. So the total poverty gap in country A, again, is going to be how much money we need to spend to get rid of poverty. So TPG in country A is going to be equal to, basically, we have 300, which is the poverty line, minus the income for person 1, 80, plus 300, minus the income for person 2, 120, and then 300 minus the income for person 3, which is 220. All right, add those all up, and you end up with 220 plus 180 plus 80. And if you do that, that should end up being, I believe that is 480. Okay, and then the average poverty gap is going to be equal to the total poverty gap divided by the head count, which is then 480 divided by 3, which is 160. So on average, you would need to spend $160 per poor person to eliminate poverty in country A. Now let's do the same thing for country B. Total poverty gap, again, is just how much money would you need to spend to get rid of poverty in country B. All right, so we've got 300 minus 200. So that's how much you need to spend to get rid of poverty for the first person, plus 300 minus 220, plus 300 minus 260. Okay, plus finally 300 minus 280. Okay, and then you add those all up. That's going to be 100 plus 80 plus 40, 20. Okay, which if I did my math right here, that's going to be 180 plus 60, that's 240. Okay. And then we know that the average poverty gap for country B is simply the total poverty gap divided by the head count, which is 240 over 4, which is going to be equal to $60. So on average for country B, we need to spend $60 per poor person to eliminate poverty, which is much less than the $160 per poor person that we would need to spend in country A. So again, two ways of computing income-based measures of poverty. We could either count the number of people that are in a state of poverty, or we could figure out on average how much would we need to spend to eliminate poverty in a country. The first tells us how many people are in poverty. The second tells us how severe is poverty for those that are in that state of poverty. Okay, so useful measures, certainly very useful income-based measures of poverty, but as we've seen in Module 2, income-based measures oftentimes don't tell us everything, right? We do sometimes fall short because income is a potential, right? Income, a lack of income in the case, means that it's possible, it's more likely that you are going to be suffering from the deprivations of poverty, but it's not guaranteed, right? So you could have a really low income below the poverty line, and maybe you got a lot of community support. Maybe you're in a country where there's a really generous welfare system, and you're actually not suffering from some of the deprivations of poverty. Alternatively, you could have an income that's above the poverty line, but for whatever reason, you are suffering those things that we associate with being in a state of poverty. You're hungry. You can't send your kids to school because you need them to work. There's malnourishment. People are dying because they don't have access to reliable health care. So again, we don't want to rely purely on income-based measures of poverty because income, again, is a potential. It could mean that you have enough income to escape poverty, or it might not. It could mean that lack of income means that you are more exposed to the deprivations of poverty, but then again, maybe you're not. And so we want to be a little bit careful relying just on income-based measures of poverty. And so for that reason, the UN created something called the Multidimensional Poverty Index. And this is somewhat analogous to the Human Development Index that they created, in that it's more of an outcome-based measure of poverty. It is, in terms of its expansiveness, probably a better measure of poverty than I would say the Human Development Index is a measure of development. So the MPI, it's a little bit complicated, the calculation for it, and it is useful at least to kind of go through the components of it just to kind of see are sort of those outcomes, that those deprivations of poverty that we associate with, sort of that state of being in poverty, rather than just thinking about, oh, you have a low income. But basically the MPI accounts for not just the number of people that are in poverty, but also the severity of poverty. So it combines together the headcount ratio and the total poverty gap. And it does this basically by being equal to, essentially, it's the fraction of the population that are classified as multidimensionally poor, MPI poor. And we're going to go over this in a second, but basically you are MPI poor if you suffer from at least a third of the deprivations of poverty that the UN has defined across three categories: health, and income. And then it also looks at the intensity of poverty. So this is sort of their analog to the total poverty gap. And the intensity of poverty is basically what fraction of these deprivations are you actually suffering from. So the first basically just says how many people are in a state of MPI poverty. The second looks at, how bad is MPI poverty for these people. All right, so let's take a look at the deprivations of poverty for the MPI. So the first dimension they look at is education. And there's two deprivations here. The first is years of schooling. So basically, this is a deprivation if nobody in your household has completed at least 5 years of schooling. And the second is child school attendance, and this is a deprivation if you have a school-aged child and they're not enrolled in school. So both of these have a weight of 1.6 or 0.167. So basically, if you have either of those things, then this goes towards your MPI score. by adding 0.167. So if you suffered from both of these, if nobody in your household has 5 years of schooling and you do have kids in your household and they're not in school, then already your MPI score is up to 0.33 and you're classified as MPI poor. If you only have one of those, then your MPI score is 0.167 and you're not yet MPI poor. Okay. The second classification is health. And the two deprivations here is child mortality. So this is a deprivation if any child in your household has died. And the second is nutrition, which is if anybody in your household, child or adult, is suffering from malnutrition. So each of these also have scores of 0.167. So again, if you have both of those are true for you, you get 0.167 plus 0.167. That automatically qualifies you as MPI poor. If you only have one of them, it's 0.167. Okay. And then finally, we have, this dimension that they classify as living standards. And basically here, this is a deprivation if you don't have any one of the following 6 things. So if your household does not have electricity, or it doesn't have reliable sanitation, or you don't have access to clean drinking water, if your household has a dirt floor, if you don't have access to clean cooking fuel, if you don't own any of the assets defined, basically it's a television, a phone, a radio, a bicycle, or an automobile. If you don't have any of those. So each one of those things that you don't have increases your MPI score by 1/18 or 0.056, 5.6%. So basically, if you lack 3 of those, for example, then that's equivalent to having had a child die or not having a child enrolled in school. Okay, so basically what we do is we take a look at a household and we count up the number of deprivations that they have, and we attach the associated score with each of those deprivations. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize these weights. You need to know what the deprivations are, but I'll give you the weights. All right, so I don't think it's that important to memorize numbers. But I do want you to understand the way that this is computed. All right, so an example in computing the MPI. So here we've got 4 households, okay? And household has a size, and this matters because if we're going to count the number of people that are in poverty, obviously a larger household, if it's in poverty, is going to contribute more than a smaller household. So we've got 4 people in household 1, 7 and 2, 5 and 3, and then 4 people in household 4. And we then basically see, do these households have any of those deprivations of poverty? So let's go through household 1. Household 1 is doing well for education. At least one person in that household has completed 6 years of schooling, and they have at least one school-age child, all of the school-age children in their household are enrolled in school. Now, maybe it's the case that that household doesn't have any school-age children, but then they would still get a 0 for that. Okay. Nobody in the household is malnourished. However, they have had at least one child. So that shows up right there. And remember that having had a child die adds 0.167 to your MPI score. Now, when we look at living conditions, the only thing that they lack is clean cooking fuel. So this household is using dirty cooking fuel. So if they're cooking with dung or firewood or charcoal. And so remember, that's going to add 0.056 to their MPI score. So basically they get 0.167, having had to get 0.056 from using dirty cooking. This gives them a score, if you didn't round, of 0.222 or 22.2%. They are not in multidimensional poverty. However, households 2, 3, and 4 are in MPI poverty. So household 2 is in MPI poverty because right away, if you just look at their education, they suffer from both of those deprivations. Nobody in the household's got 6 years of schooling, and they've had at least one school-age child not enrolled in school. All right. They have had a child die, and then they lack electricity. They lack clean cooking fuel, and they don't have any of those assets. So if you add up all the deprivations, 0.167, 0.167, 0.167, 0.056, 0.056, 0.056, 0.056, add those all together, and basically they suffer from 72.2% of the deprivations of poverty. So that's a really poor household. Household 5, you add those all, end up with an MPI score of 38.9%. Household 4 ends up with an MPI score of 50%. So households 2, 3, and 4 are above that 33% threshold. So we've got 3 households that are in MPI poverty. So the number of households that are in MPI poverty, basically we can see this little summary here. We have household 2, household 3, and household 4. And we have the number of people in each household, as well as the intensity of poverty in each household. So 7, 5, and 4, you add those up, that's 16 people. Household 1 has 4 people. So there's a total of 20 country, of whom 16 are MPI poor. So 16 over 20 is going to be your headcount ratio, and that is 80% of that country's population is in MPI poverty. Now, the second thing we need to do is we need to figure out what's the average intensity of MPI poverty. And basically, we've got household 2 has an intensity of 72%, household 3 has an intensity of about 39%, and household 4 has an intensity of about 50%. Average those, but that would be not 100% accurate because these households have different sizes. So what we do is we do a weighted of the poverty intensities. So basically, we have 16 people that are poor total. 7 of them have an intensity of 72.2%. 5 of those 16 have an intensity of 38.9, and 4 of those 16 have an intensity of 50%. So the weighted average would basically multiply each of these intensities by the share of poor people that have that particular intensity. And so you can either do this by doing, for example, 16 times 0.72, 5 over 16 times 0.389, 4 over 16 times 0.5, or equivalently, in the numerator, just multiply the intensity by the number of people in the household and then divide by the total number of poor people. Mathematically, it's the same thing. And you end up with an average intensity of 0.562. Now, before you freak out, I'm not actually going to ask you to compute MPI poverty. I want you to know what the deprivations are. I'm not going to have you go through, all of these calculations. I do want you to know what the deprivations are and why MPI poverty is a better definition than, for example, an income-based measure. But again, I'm not going to, require you to go through all of these steps. Why? Okay. And so we finally are able to compute the multidimensional poverty index as the product of the fraction of the population that's in MPI poverty, in this example, 80%, and then the weighted average intensity of poverty amongst those poor people. And on average, those in poverty suffer from 56% of the deprivations that are there, 56.2%. Multiply those two together, and you end up with an index of 0.45. Now, this number by itself doesn't really have an interpretation, but it is useful when comparing it to other countries. And so, for example, if we at MPIs across the world, and here I've got these grouped by, and so, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo has the worst, I think, amongst the worst level of MPI poverty. So about 72.5% of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo classify as MPI poor, meaning that they suffer from at least a third of the deprivations of poverty. And on average, those people so sorry about that, dropped out of the recording for a second. Let's go back here to the notes. Okay, hopefully that was seamless transition. But basically, what we're talking about is we want to make sure we're looking at not just the head count of people that are in MPI poverty, but also the intensity of that poverty. So again, we can look, for example, at a country, compare Laos and the Philippines. Now, poverty is much lower in the Philippines than it is in Laos, right? So Laos, 41% of people basically are classified as MPI poor, and the Philippines about 7.5%. So way lower headcount ratio. But if we're actually looking at are in poverty, people in Laos and the people in the Philippines that are classified as poor are suffering from about the same level of deprivation of poverty. So again, we want to make sure we're looking at both of these things. Okay, so again, a really useful statistic. We don't want to completely discount income-based measures because they are valuable as well. Countries that tend to have high levels of poverty based on income also tend to have high levels of poverty based off of the MPI, but it is also very useful to look at this outcome-based measure. So we're going to use all of these. And then in the next section, we're going to actually talk about whether or not too much poverty is a bad thing. We'll talk about whether or not too much inequality is a bad thing. And then in the final section, we'll actually take a look at some policies that could be targeting equality and poverty. All right, so I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you later.